Alright, so this is gonna be episode 2 of the Exposé VGC. This episode is gonna be about the class chart. Alright. So episode 1 covered the type chart, is the name I give it, and it is referring to basically how you would classify each type in Pokemon. Right? And then how those types make up your team. Right? So for this episode, we're gonna cover class chart and take a deeper dive into each Pokemon and how you further decide how to build your team. All right. So I think this is gonna be a 3 episode series. So this is gonna be the second episode out of 3, and so yeah, I'm thinking I'm going to probably record the 3rd episode today and then probably post it on a later date, or maybe I'll just hold off on it and then deliver it and then post it on that same day. But still deciding. So, but either way, it's gonna be 3 episodes, and so yeah. Hope you enjoy the series, and yeah, let's get into it. All right, so just to recap first, we covered type chart, right? So I explained that there are 6 basically type combinations that you can have, right? And so given that there's 6 slots in your team, you have basically one of each type Pokemon, right? So the reason why you'd want that is because basically, so I have the boxes sorted out here for my competitive Pokemon that are finished, and right, there are 6 boxes, right, for the 6 types of boxes for the 6 different type combinations, right? And so kind of illustrate kind of why you wouldn't want to have multiple types of Pokemon on the same team. Alright, so this is a sample team that we're gonna cover for this video. So I'll just put them aside. Alright. Alright. So the reason why you wouldn't want to have, right, so I'm gonna try to explain this here. So the reason why you wouldn't want to have multiple types of the same Pokemon on your team is because of um, your team's power level just going down. If you have multiple Pokemon, right, of the same type class, right? So, or type profile rather. So let's take a team like, let's take a Pokemon like Dene here. So this would be like a Dene set that you want to run, right? And it has pickup, right? Ability is pickup, but this guy's supposed to have plus, so I'll just do it now. Alright. Ability plus. Right? So there's something like the Dene, right? And this the Dene has plus, right? And so it has entrainment as well. And if you're familiar with the ability plus, right, you know that Pokemon that if two Pokemon have on the if you have a Pokemon that has plus and it's beside a Pokemon that has plus or minus, then both Pokemon get 50% more special attack, right? So take something like Dene plus, right, and entrainment, and you could put it beside anything, right? That has any special Pokemon, right? That you'd want to really get a lot of special attack with. Let's say you want to do Wigglytuff for some reason, right? So now you have the Dene and Wigglytuff, right? And you just want to further expand on that. So let's say you take like Hydreigon, right? Slowking, right? Let's just say Bronzong, and then you know Latios, right? So you have a team, right? Obviously, I'm being hyperbolic here, but you have this team here that is, you know, basically revolving around this Dedenne with plus, right? And you know, Dedenne can give it, you know, you can use entrainment to give your partner plus, and then it has 50% more special attack, right? That's all well and good, right? But since this team's type-ins, right, are designed, you know, to fulfill specific purpose, right? Your power level relative to your opponent's team is going to be significantly lower, right? So you may have 50% more special attack, right? But you're also just going to have way less types that you hit, right? And so you can see how your power level will go down, right? So yeah, that's just a quick explanation as to why you wouldn't want to run uh, multiple Pokemon of the same type, of the same type profile, rather. Right? Right? So yeah. So yeah, that's essentially why you wouldn't want to run, you know, multiple Pokemon with the same uh type profile, right? So gonna get into more deeper team building uh skills that you need to develop basically to, you know, basically have a team that's more fitted to what you're looking for, right? So yeah, this is gonna be the second part of kind of uh what makes teams work, what makes teams not work, etc. All right. So let's get into the chart. So class chart here. So kind of what's being displayed here is basically the two classes, right? So there's two main classes, right? When it comes to Pokemon's game design, and they are partners, right, and dummies, right. Those are just the terms I'm using to describe them, right? So yeah, so partners, as I illustrate here, So partners and dummies would constitute um, battle style within a role. All right. So what I mean by that is that besides the role that they're fitted into, right, which we're gonna get into in the third video, uh, is just the fact that besides just the role that the Pokemon is trying to play, there's also the battle style, right? So you have partners, right, and you have dummies, right? And partners are staple battlers, right? So staple battlers are essentially like battlers on your team that would partner to facilitate a specific mission, right? What I mean by that is that they will basically be on your team and they have some sort of thing that they're very specifically good at or specifically are trying to accomplish. And then you basically have them on your team to help facilitate accomplishing that, right? So that's very kind of mystified. So I'm going to sort of try to give you an example, right? So just go back to that same uh, example, right? I used the Dene, right? So I have markings here on all these Pokemon, right? I'll just scroll through these Pokemon so you can see, right? You're familiar, kind of with Pokemon. You have these markings that every Pokemon has. I think it was introduced in Generation 3. And yeah, there's 6 markings, and then there's basically 2 different colors. So you essentially have 12 markings, right? So all these Pokemon have different markings, right? So yeah, you can see all these Pokemon have different markings, right? And so I have this Dedenne here, and so I'll just kind of go over what these markings mean, right? So for me, I use the first marking slot, and then it's red or blue, right? And blue means to me that the Pokemon is complete, right? And then red means that it's incomplete, right? So this is a red mark, so it's incomplete. Then this mark, I just choose to make it red. It doesn't really matter, but it's also just to distinguish, for the fact that blue means complete, so it's easier to basically match these colors, right? So yeah. So the second mark, I use these 2 marks to designate if they are partners or if they're dummies, right? So this first mark is for partner, and then this second mark would be for dummy, right? So you see this mark is cleared up. So this represents that this Pokemon is a partner, right? Then I use these last marks, right, to designate basically um, to designate whether they fall into one of the 3 categories, right? So go back here, right, and I specified 3 categories, right? So I specified for partners, you don't get to choose your partners, right? You get to choose your partners, right? And then you have a lot of partners, right? So third mark here would represent that you have a lot of partners, right? And so in the Denny's case, the Denny has plus and it has entrainment, right? And so there are a lot of Pokemon, that well, actually, yeah, sorry. So yeah, there are a lot of Pokemon that can fit into this, right? So yeah, so I would specify the Dene as being a partner Pokemon that has a lot of partners, right? So that's essentially kind of how I kind of keep track of which Pokemon are partners or not, which Pokemon are dummies not, right? So yeah, in this case, you see partners to facilitate a specific mission, right? In the case of the Dene, right, uh, you have the Dene with plus and entrainment. Essentially, what it's trying to do is it's trying to give Pokemon beside it plus so that I can have 50% more special attack, right? Pretty straightforward, right? So that's partners, right? And dummies are neutral battlers, right? And they make up the core of your team, right? And so as opposed to stable battlers, right? If you play like the Pokemon trading card game, you're familiar with the term staples, right? Staples are just core pieces of whatever format that you're playing, right? In the case of Pokemon, you're playing the standard format probably, and so yeah, you would have staples, right? Not to get into any Pokemon trading card game staples, but in this case, staple battlers would represent basically Pokemon that are part of a format, right? That are staples to facilitating a specific mission, right? So in the case of the Dene's mission is to give a Pokemon 50% special attack, right? So in the case of neutral battlers, right, these are just battlers that are just gonna go on your team, right? So this is basically gonna make up the core of your team, hence core of your team, right? And so these Pokemon are gonna make up most of your team, right? And so you can just go back to the team sample team to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, right? So this team has more Pico, right? You can see its markings, right? Um, so again, it's not complete, and I mark it as a dummy, and then these three markings represent bruiser, mid range, or support, right? As I illustrated. You want to go back, check it out. So in this case, I mean support. Sorry, not bruiser, mid range, support. It's support, bruiser, support, mid range, bruiser, right? So this mark here means that the Dene, I mean Morpeko, is a support, right? So you see on this team, right? You have this Morpeko, right? That's a dummy. You have Slacking, that's a dummy. Here, that's a dummy. Dragonacle, that's a dummy. Mo, that's a dummy. And then Armor Rouge, which is a partner, right? So partners are going to make up the core of your team, right? They're going to take up a large slot, right? And to illustrate kind of why you wouldn't want like three partners, for example, on your team, even two is a lot, but three is definitely going overboard, right? Just put the sample team back, right? So actually, let's just use the sample team, and I'll just take the first three Pokemon. I'll leave them, and I'll just take three partner Pokemon, right? So I have something like Stone Journer, right? something like Rotom Feet, and then something like Chempow, right? So you have these three, you have these very powerful first three dummy slots, right? And then you have three uh partner slots, right? So it may appear right, like okay, Chempow, right? But what you have here is basically, because remember, VGC is you bring six and you pick four, right? So essentially, you just kind of lock yourself into having to take two partners and then two dummies, right? Because basically, if you bring all three dummies, right? Then you're gonna have you're gonna have to have at least one dummy on the board, right? And in the case of Pokemon like Stonjourner and Chempow, probably better that you want to switch them in anyways, right? Because their abilities, are probably stronger when your opponent, doesn't see them coming, rather than it just being on your board, right? And so you basically force yourself, you know, into basically only four opens, right? So your team becomes very easy to, pick off, right? So that's kind of why you wouldn't want to, you know, carry three partners, right? It makes your team very easy to pick off, right? Right. So that's why you want to have dummies make up the core of your team, right? But and so core of your team would be like, well, it'd want to be five, right? Four is definitely kind of uh four is definitely a little bit you know, definitely not what you want, right? Definitely want it to be five, right? All right. So that's dummies and partners, right? And so let's get into the types of dummies, right? So we'll start with dummies since they're gonna make up the core of your team. So dummies them generally fall into two different categories, basically, right? So you have what I call do your role, right? It's just a kind of funny way of basically categorizing this class of dummies, right? So by do your role, it's Pokemon that generally, have a lot of, agency. Sorry, have a lot of agency. So they're able to, you know, have a more uh have a more wide range, right, of playstyles, right, as opposed to fitting into these three categories here, right. So there's two types of dual role Pokemon, and you have skillful, right, and then you have beautiful, right. So skillful kind of explains itself, right. These are Pokemon that are generally right, gonna fit into a role, right, and then since they don't really have a necessarily go to way of being played, you can really express your skill with the Pokemon in ways that you wouldn't necessarily be able to, right, with the other class of do your roll dummies, right? So to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about, so for example, something like a so let's take something like Blissey, for example, right? So Blissey here, where we have its markings, right? So this is a complete Blissey, and it's a dummy, right? And it's a support, right? So Blissey would follow under more of a skillful category because Blissey um, is able to take on, a lot of roles, right? If you ignore Blissey, right? In this case, this Blissey has echoed voice, right? So it has a lot of, good supporter moves, right? Life Steal, Shadow Ball, Charm, right? And then it has echoed voice, right? So your opponents, right, is not going to be able to just ignore this Blissey, right? Because this Blissey has echoed voice, right? So if your opponent is starting to take lines, right, that are, basically ignoring your Blissey, then you can just start pressing echoed voice, and then you can just get a really high base power echoed voice. And it doesn't matter what the Pokemon is. Obviously, if the Pokemon has a lot of special defense and HP, it's not going to do it a lot. But if you're just pressing a echoed voice, right, a really high base power echoed voice, into your average HP and special defense slot. This Blissey has special attack and it's a quiet nature, right? So it's going to it's going to do a lot of damage, right? It's a positive nature and then max special attack, right? Echo voice. Every time you use it, its power goes up by 40, I believe. It might double. I'm not sure, but no, I don't think it doubles. I think it's by 40, right? So you get 40, and then 80, and then 120, and I think it stops. I think it stops at 120 if I'm not mistaken. But no, it might go up to 200. Let me just double check. Pretty sure it goes up to 200, right? Yeah, it goes up to 200, right? So again, if you ignore this Blissey, right? Blissey is a very hard Pokemon to knock out, right? So by the time you get to 120, right, and you're still ignoring it, Blissey's probably just going to be able to kill both Pokemon with two attacks, right? A 160 base power Echoed Voice, and then a 200 base power Echoed Voice, right? And 200 base power, it doesn't matter what your stats are. Blissey in this case has 75 special attack. 200 base power is going to hurt, right? You take something like Tinkaton, right, with Gigaton Hammer. I think Tinkaton has 77 attack or 73. So yeah, and you've probably seen, Gigaton Hammers do a lot of damage, and it's the same thing with Echoed Voice, right? So yeah, that's kind of that skill expression part of Blissey, right? So yeah, that's what I mean by skillful, basically, right? Opposed to skillful, you have dutiful, right? Which is not a very common word used, but dutiful, the root word obviously is, duty, right? And so, when you're duty, you mean you think about, something that you need to do, right? And so with dutiful Pokemon, um yeah, they're basically Pokemon that are more easy to use generally, and it's because generally they're going to want to do something very specific, and straying away from that is just going to make them basically useless, right? And so obviously that doesn't mean that skillful Pokemon are better than dutiful Pokemon, right? It's just that dutiful Pokemon want to do something very specific, right? And in that case, in most cases that's probably more for your benefit, right? Than having a Pokemon that can do a lot of things, right? So don't think of it as, oh, this Pokemon can do less things, so it's not as good. Think of it more like this Pokemon can do this thing, right? Specifically, and it's going to be very reliable for me as a result, right? So think of it more like being reliable, right? All right, all right. So that's basically kind of the two uh, types of dummies, right? So then dummies obviously have like the part of them that's more telegraphed, right? So the more telegraphed side of dummies, right, is you have bruisers, right? You have mid ranges, and then you have supports, right? So just quickly go into this. So bruisers uh, are gonna hurt you, right? Right? That's what bruisers do, right? Hence bruiser, right? The root word is bruise. So that's kind of what it's meant by bruiser, right? So bruisers hurt you. So mid ranges, what they do is they surprise you, right? So bruiser mid rangers, again, right? They're not necessarily gonna fit into a category that is bruiser, right? Or support. They're gonna get into. So they're generally Pokemon that again, it's basically the element of surprise, right? Pokemon, and so that's what they're trying to accomplish, right? And supports, they help you, right? Right. Make sure I'm not forget anything. I'm just checking my notes real quick. Yeah. Right. All right. So yeah. So the do your role part is basically um kind of flavor, right? And then the telegraph part is like the, well, kind of illustrate this a little better. I described this class of Pokemon as dummies, right? And dummies can kind of come off as a sort of a mean term, right, or a vulgar term, or an unkind term rather. And it's not dummy like somebody who was dumb. It's dummy like sandbag, right? That's essentially what it is, right? And it's mainly because, again, these are going to make up the core of your team, right? But if you don't want to play six dummies on your team, then you're able to just take off a slot and replace it with a partner, right? So yeah, you'd be able to just take off one of these guys and then just insert, one of these guys, right? So that's kind of why I refer to them as dummies, right? Is because they're just very easy to sacrifice for a partner slot, and so that's why I refer to them as dummies, right? So again, right, do your role is right the flavor, then the telegraph side would be the uh, profile, right? Right. So that's kind of dummies, right? So I'm not gonna get too deep into sort of um different flavors of dummies, right? And basically kind of just give a explanation as to the types of Pokemon, right? This is definitely more of an introductory video, so I don't want it to get too in depth. So just kind of take that as you will, and then you know we'll get more into it, right? So let's cover partners, right? So partners generally are characterized by these three categories, right? So first category, I categorize it as you don't get to choose your partners, right? And so what I mean by that is that partners generally um are they need to be partnered up with a Pokemon, right? And so for these types of partners, these are partners that are generally going to be partnered with a very specific type of Pokemon, so that you can so because that's essentially what that Pokemon is trying to accomplish, right? So kind of take a Pokemon to illustrate here. So let's take something like Kyogre, for example, right? So Kyogre is a partner Pokemon, right? And basically, partner is labeled as you don't get to choose your partner, right? So Kyogre, its ability is Drizzle, right? So when it comes in, it summons rain, right, for 5 turns, right? And if you have a Damp Rock for 8 turns, and so Kyogre is not a Pokemon that's generally going to be able to choose its partners because since it's summoning rain, automatically, a lot of Pokemon basically get pretty much ruled out as partners for Kyogre, right? So, for example, if you know about kind of the if you know about the properties of rain, you know that rain increases the power of water moves by 50%, and it also decreases the power of fire moves by 50%. Right. So what that does, right, is that Pokemon that are weak to water moves, for example, would be very bad partners with Kyogre because if they get hit with a water move in the rain, maybe they'll be able to survive it, but because of the 50% boost, they probably just one shot, right? And so, yeah, that would make them a very bad partner with Kyogre, right? And so Kyogre would generally be paired with Pokemon that are very good in the rain, right? Hence the categorization of you don't get to choose your partner, right? All right. So that's the first category, right? So the second category is you get to choose your partners, right? So as opposed to Pokemon like Kyogre, right, which have a very low selection of partners, right? Um, Pokemon that get to choose their partners, right, have a larger selection of partners, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that no, they have more options than these Pokemon, right? It's just that uh, in this case, you get to choose your partner actually means it actually is a kind of it's a funny way. It's kind of funny, but what it actually means the same thing as the first one here. But in this case, you have a larger selection, right? So that's why I classify it as you get to choose your partners, right? Because in this case, there's Pokemon where literally if you put them with them, you're actually hurting him, right? For example, if you put like a Rhyperior beside a Kyogre, right? Even with Solid Rock, you're still gonna probably get one shot by a water move, right? So in this case, what I mean by you don't get to choose your partners is that some Pokemon actually get hurt, by getting put with these Pokemon, right? Or you get to choose your partner, right? You can, you have a lot of options, right? But it's not necessarily going to be, the end of the world if you put them with the wrong partner, right? Hence, you get to choose your own partner. All right. So to illustrate this, pick a Pokemon here. So in this case, you have something like Dene. Well, not the Dene rather. Pick something like if I remember this correctly. Um, something like Florges, right? So Florges, right, would fall under the category of you get to choose your partners, right? This Florges has the ability Flower Veil, right? Allied grass type Pokemon are protected from status conditions and the lowering of their stats, right? So Florges, right, would be able to choose his partners because Florges would want to be partnered with grass type Pokemon, right? But again, if Florges is not beside a grass type Pokemon, it's not the end of the world, right? Um, because this Florges, can still do a lot of things with that Pokemon, right? Has grassy terrain, right? Pollen Puff, right, and Moonblast, right? And so, even though it's not partnered with a grass Pokemon, it can still be a partner for the Pokemon, right? Hence, you get to choose your partners, right? All right, so that's you get to choose your partners. Then the last category is you have a lot of partners, right? So as opposed to the first two categories, right? These are Pokemon that are more would fit into this category of staple battlers, right? So, but I want to be more specific. These are like the more iconic partners, right? So let's just illustrate this real quick. So something like all creamy, right? So all creamy fall in the category of partner that you can have a lot of partners with, right? So all creamy has abilities, has sweet veil, and I also believe it has a aroma veil too, if I'm not mistaken. Just double check. Pretty sure it has aroma veil too. Yeah, it does. Right. So all creamy, right, has these abilities: sweet veil and aroma veil. Right. So sweet veil prevents the Pokemon and its allies from falling asleep, and then aroma veil prevents the Pokemon and its allies from being affected by moves that limit your move choices. Right. So moves like taunt, torment, encore, disable, etc. Those Pokemon are immune for them. Right. So these are Pokemon that are more iconic, right? Partners, right? And then Alchemy, of course, has the signature move Decorate, right? Which sharply boosts the target's special attack and attack, right? So again, this is a very ambiguous move. So these Pokemon will fall in the category of, you have a lot of partners, right? Another Pokemon like that would be something like Maushold, right? Maushold just gets Friend Guard, reduces damage dealt to allies, and then has moves like Follow Me, right? Super Fang, you know, uh, and a signature move Population Bomb. Very good moves, support your opponent, your partner rather, right? Pretty ambiguous moves, right? And then of course you have something like Smeargle, right? So this Smeargle, of course, this is Smeargle I used to catch Pokemon, right? Obviously, this is not like a Smeargle set, but yeah. So Smeargle again, right? Can literally have any move, right? So very not like kind of kind of speaks for itself there, right? So that's the you have a lot of partners, right? Part of the partner category, right? All right. So that's the explanation of the class chart, right? So uh yeah, hope that makes sense, right? Without the roll chart, right? Um, which we'll get into in the next video. But yeah. So these are essentially the two categories, right? And then obviously you're gonna want to make dummies the core of your team because uh it'll make your team harder to pick off, right? So let's go over to the sample team. Be sure to check out kind of how this looks. So I'll just these no audio, no distractions. So yeah, there's all these story places all over the map. It's generally on Paldea, the Paldea map, and they just have no audio because they're just story places. So they just didn't put audio into place, right? So take a look at the sample team. So this team is Morpeko, Slacking, Superior, Garganackle, Mo, and Armarouge, right? So this team, and before I kind of go into the sample team, right? We're kind of just like the last section, so we're just gonna close it in. I'm actually gonna do a special fourth episode for this series, right? So we're gonna have three main episodes. Then there's just gonna be a special fourth episode where I'm going to just give you a lot of details about Pokemon for you to digest. That's just gonna kind of be a treat for me to sort of yeah, for people who are very ambitious team builders, so they can have something to digest, right? Because it can get pretty tough team building, right? And it can also just get very frustrating, when you don't get the results you want. So I'm gonna do a special fourth episode. I don't even know what I'm gonna call it, but yeah, just wanna announce that before I get into this last section. So we're doing pretty good on time. So yeah, just wanted to do that quick. And so yeah, look forward to that. Right. So let's get into the sample team here. Um so we'll just go through it quick. Just look through the markings. So I don't know why that's marked as complete. Pretty sure it's not complete. Yeah, so I don't know why that's marked as complete. But 4 out of 6 are complete, right? Um so Morpico, right, is in the balanced sorcery slot, right? And so basically what it's trying to do here is, familiar with Morpico, right? Morpico has the ability Hunger Switch, right? So at the end of every turn, it changes between Hangry mode and Full Belly mode. And essentially what it does is it just changes the typing of this move or wheel, right? So yeah, you're going to want this move or else your Morpico is just going to be useless, basically, right? It's just going to basically just have its stats and its attacks, right? So basically, Morpico just has a slot that is basically taxes, right? And it's Aura Wheels, right? So Aura Wheels 110 base power physical move and increase its stat, increase its speed stat, right? And it changes every single turn from electric to dark, right? So I think it's when it's full belly, it's electric, and then when it's hangry, it's dark, right? So basically, this thing is a support. So in this case, it has crunch, fake out, or real quash, right? And this is a more of a dutiful dummy, right? Because essentially what this thing is trying to do is it's trying to get a really high speed set so that it can use quash, right? And then basically Pokemon on your team that wouldn't necessarily be faster, and some Pokemon would go before those Pokemon, right? So that's essentially what you're trying to do, right, with this more Pico, right? So that's why it's support, right? So then you have Slacking here. Slacking is a life orb, and it is a mid range, right? And this is definitely more of a skillful dummy, right? So this thing has Shadow Claw, Throw Chop, Double Edge, Slack Off, right? And if you're familiar with Slacking, it has very, very high base stats, right? But it has its ability Truant. Each time the Pokemon uses a move, it spends the next turn loafing around, which means that it can select a move, but the move is just not going to go through, right? If the Truant ability is still active, which is the stipulation, right? So yeah, so you have very high base stat, and but every other turn you can't make a move, right? So it's a very skillful Pokemon, right? And this one is attack HP, right? But Slacking still has a lot of very high base speed, has like 100 base speed, so it's going to be faster than most Pokemon. But some Pokemon, are that threaten it are going to have a higher base speed than it, or just a higher speed stat in general. And so something like Morpico, right, is going to be able to help it KO Pokemon, right, that it can outspeed and threaten it, right? So then that's kind of like the mid range part of it too, right? Is that Slacking is going to surprise you, right? And in this case, Slacking itself is not going to surprise you. It's actually the Pokemon that are around Slacking, right? But Slacking again is just a surprising Pokemon by itself as well, so that's why it's a mid range Pokemon, right? So then you have Superior, this team. So Superior is also mid range, right? This is Stellar Terra Superior with ability shields, right? And it has Contrary, Timid Nature, right? So Contrary basically it just reverses any stat changes, right? So if you try to increase its stats, it's gonna drop it, and if you try to drop its stats, it's gonna increase it, right? And pretty familiar if you've played a Pokemon core game, you know, pretty familiar with uh, the move Leaf Storm, right? Very high base power, special grass move. But when you use it, your special attack stat drops significantly. I mean, drops harshly, right? So it drops by 2 stages. But in this case, because Superior has Contrary, it's going to increase by 2 stages, right? And in this case, we have Stellar Terra Blast. And then, if you're familiar with Stellar Terra Blast, you know that when you use it, your attack and special attack drop by 1 stage. In this case, it increases by 1 stage, right? So again, you don't have to run Superior or Contrary, but obviously it's more powerful with uh uh with the with Contrary, right? And also fits it more into its category, which is its telegraph category rather, which is mid range, right? And so yeah, it's a very common set that you should run on it, and then this case has Gastro Acid, right? So that if it's out with slacking, then it can turn off Truant. And then Gastros is just a good move in general. Pokemon that have abilities that they lean on to. And it's pretty ironic. We have something like Morpeko, for example. I don't think you can turn off Hunger Switch, but yeah, abilities that can get pretty annoying. You can just use Gastro Acid on them, and then Helping Hand, right? Because again, besides the slacking doesn't have any damage modifiers except for Life Orb. So Helping Hand is essentially its damage modifier, right? Right, and then it's a mid range, right? So then we have Garganackle, right? It's also a dummy, and it's a bruiser, right? Um, and this is definitely more of a dutiful bruiser. If you're familiar with Garganackle, has this move Salt Cure, right? Basically the same thing as Life, with Leech Seed, right? You take an eighth of your damage, you take an eighth of your health every turn. But for water and steel types, they take a quarter, right? So very powerful attack, right? But this is generally the attack that you're going to be using, right? So it's definitely a more dutiful Pokemon, right? And it's a bruiser because all it really is trying to accomplish is just hurting you, right? So you may think that something like Garganackle is a tank, right, and therefore it's probably like a support or a mid range. But since this thing is really only trying to hurt you, it's definitely just a very tanky bruiser, right? Then you have Kumo on this team, right? It's also a dummy. It's a mid range, and uh has the special Kumo, right? If you're familiar with Kumo, has a very good physical move pool and a very good special move pool, right? But in this case, you definitely probably gonna want to run it special because in I think it was Gen 8, it got the move Clanger Soul, right? I think it was actually Clanger Soul had in Gen 7, but I think it got Clanger Scales in Gen 8. If I'm not mistaken. And it's just a special signature special move that it has, right? And so again, right, because it can be physical or special, it falls into the mid range category. And then you have this Armor Rouge, right? Just a partner, and Armor Rouge generally is just gonna be protecting Pokemon, and so has Wide Guard, fire a mystical fire, right, to drop special attack, and then Fire Spin to trap Pokemon you're trying to KO, right? So just go over this team, right? If you want to get an example of kind of how uh you would leverage dummies and partners. So that's the end of the video. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.